David Chin was 38 years old when his wife of 10 years threw a glass of champagne in his face at the Rosewood Hotel in Manhattan. The 150 investment bankers in attendance had no idea they were watching the opening act of the most catastrophic miscalculation of her life. He stood motionless, Dom Perignon dripping from his chin onto the Italian marble floor, while his wife Rachel, draped in a Chanel suit worth $12,000, laughed alongside her new mentor Thomas Bradford, founder of Titan Capital Group. The documents on the mahogany table represented a $600 million merger, the pinnacle of Rachel's ascent from marketing director to chief strategy officer. In just 5 years, her compensation had skyrocketed from $98,000 to $520,000 annually, with equity grants valued at $3.1 million. She'd earned every cent through relentless 90-hour weeks, ruthless networking, and eliminating anyone who stood in her path, including her husband. "Jesus, David, you're so awkward," Rachel said without looking at him, signing the acquisition agreement with a flourish. "This is the most important moment of my career, and you can't even hold a drink properly. Why don't you disappear for a while? The professionals need to work." Laughter rippled through the crowd. David recognized the faces: board members from Bradford Holdings, analysts from Morgan Stanley who'd structured the deal, Rachel's entire executive team from her company, Apex Technologies. They'd all witnessed him fumble the champagne flute she'd deliberately knocked from his grasp. They saw the discount Macy's blazer, the fossil watch worth $120, the uncomfortable smile of someone who didn't belong among private helicopters and seven-figure bonuses. What none of them knew, what Rachel had been too consumed with empire building to discover, was that David Chin wasn't the struggling web developer earning $68,000 annually that she introduced him as. He was the majority shareholder and anonymous co-founder of Bradford Holdings, the $3.8 billion investment firm about to absorb her company. And the contract she was signing with such satisfaction would annihilate her in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. But David wasn't ready to reveal that. Not here. Not yet. He'd been orchestrating this moment for 16 months, ever since the evening he'd returned early from a supposed client meeting and overheard Rachel on the phone with her divorce lawyer, plotting her exit the instant her Apex stock options vested, scheduled for 2 weeks after this acquisition finalized. "Of course, honey," David said quietly, reaching for a linen napkin. "I apologize. I'll wait downstairs." "Don't bother," Rachel replied, barely acknowledging him as she shook hands with Thomas Bradford. "The celebration will run late. Take the subway home. I'll be back whenever." David nodded, performing his role flawlessly, the role he'd maintained for 5 years while Rachel climbed her ladder and forgot the man who'd funded her executive MBA at Columbia, who'd paid $52,000 toward her student debt, who'd relocated 4 times for her career advancement, the man she'd begun calling my practice husband, to colleagues when she thought he wasn't listening. He exited the ballroom with champagne staining his shirt and humiliation burning in his throat, precisely the image Rachel wanted displayed. What she didn't see was the text message David sent from the elevator. "Initiate Phase 2. Bradford acquisition approved. Execute the Morrison Protocol." The recipient was Jennifer Park, the $1,100 an hour attorney who'd been working David's case for 13 months and who happened to be senior partner at Whitmore & Park LLP, the same firm that had structured the Apex acquisition. The Morrison Protocol was something Rachel's lawyers had overlooked in their examination of the 763-page merger agreement. It was named after David's late mentor, Stephen Morrison, who taught him that the most effective revenge in business wasn't loud. It was embedded in subsection 9.7d of legally binding contracts. The origin of David Chen's position as silent majority shareholder of Bradford Holdings began 17 years earlier in a Princeton computer lab with a scholarship student from Queens who possessed an extraordinary talent for algorithmic trading. David had been 21 when he created a machine learning model that could identify venture capital opportunities 4 months before they became apparent to conventional investors. His classmate, Thomas Bradford, had been the legacy admission with $15 million in trust fund capital and connections that unlocked doors David didn't know existed. They'd formed a partnership. David would supply the intelligence and strategic analysis. Thomas would provide the funding and serve as the public figurehead. They'd divide everything 62-38. With David holding controlling interest. They'd formalized the partnership on November 12, 2007, witnessed by Stephen Morrison, then an associate at a boutique firm in Boston. The agreement was bulletproof. David would remain an undisclosed partner, his ownership maintained through layered trusts and corporate entities that even the SEC had validated. Over 17 years, Bradford Holdings had expanded from a $15 million startup to a $3.8 billion investment powerhouse. David had directed every significant investment decision. Thomas had been the magnetic CEO who commanded attention at conferences and galas. David had been perfectly content with this arrangement because the compensation was extraordinary. His personal net worth currently stood at $692 million, and he genuinely preferred analytical work over publicity. Then he'd encountered Rachel at a technology summit in Seattle in 2014. She'd been an emerging talent at a mid-tier software firm. Ambitious, razor-sharp, captivating. He'd been drawn to her intensity, her intellect, her refusal to accept mediocrity. They'd married 9 months later in an intimate ceremony in the Hamptons. David had presented himself as an independent web developer, which was technically accurate. He did consulting for Bradford Holdings. He simply hadn't mentioned owning 62% of the company. Why the deception? Initially it was a test. He'd watched his father get exploited by women attracted to his wealth after selling his pharmaceutical patent for $3.2 million when David was 14. The parade of opportunistic relationships had taught him caution about disclosing assets. He'd wanted confirmation that Rachel loved him for himself, not his portfolio. But then months became years and Rachel's career accelerated. David discovered he enjoyed being underestimated. He liked observing her navigate corporate warfare, supporting her from behind the curtain. He'd helped her rehearse for interviews, coached her on negotiations, even leveraged his Bradford connections to position her resume with the right executives at Apex Technologies. She'd never suspected that the lucky break that landed her the VP role had originated from a recommendation David had quietly orchestrated. For 6 years their marriage had been solid, unconventional perhaps, with Rachel constantly traveling and David working from their Brooklyn brownstone, but solid. They'd purchased a modest home for $780,000 in Park Slope, drove practical vehicles. Rachel had a BMW 3 Series worth $51,000. David kept his aging Toyota Camry worth maybe $6,000. They discussed children eventually when Rachel's career stabilized. Then Rachel secured the CSO position 5 years ago, and everything fractured. The late nights became endless. The business trips multiplied. The salary jumped to $520,000, and suddenly David's supposed $68,000 income seemed embarrassing to her. She started making remarks, subtle criticisms about his modest ambitions, his contentment with simplicity. She began attending charity functions without him, claiming he wouldn't mesh with her corporate circle. She started introducing him as, "My husband, he does web stuff," with a tone suggesting she was apologizing for his existence. David had endured it because he loved her. Because he believed marriages weathered difficult phases. Because he kept expecting she'd remember who she'd been before the corner office and stock options. Then came the night 16 months ago that transformed everything. David had told Rachel he had a late client call. He actually did, a video conference with Thomas Bradford about a potential acquisition in the biotech sector. The meeting concluded early, around 8:45 p.m. on a Thursday in May 2023. David drove home to their brownstone on Sterling Place, entered through the garage, and heard Rachel's voice floating from the back garden. She was on her phone, drinking wine, laughing in a way she hadn't laughed with him in years. "No, Michelle, I'm serious," Rachel was saying. "The second my Apex options vest after this Bradford acquisition, I'm filing. David has been an anchor for years. He's nice enough, sure, but God, I need a partner who operates at my altitude, you know? Someone who matches my trajectory." David had frozen in the kitchen doorway, car keys still in his hand. "I've already consulted with Howard Chin. Yeah, the divorce specialist, the one who got Karen $6 million from her ex-husband. He says because New York has equitable distribution, David is entitled to a portion of everything I've accumulated during the marriage, which is infuriating because he's contributed essentially nothing. But Howard's developing an approach. We can argue that my career success was purely my achievement, especially given David's minimal earnings. We might limit my settlement exposure to maybe $350,000. She'd paused, listening to her friend. "No, I don't feel guilty. I've evolved past him, Michelle. I'm earning $520,000 annually, plus equity worth millions. I'm dining with CEOs and venture capitalists, and I come home to someone who gets excited about debugging code and thinks Chipotle is acceptable dining. I deserve better. I deserve someone from my echelon." Another pause, then laughter. "Oh God, you should see how he looks at these corporate events when I force him to attend. Like a lost puppy who knows he doesn't belong but is desperately trying. It's honestly mortifying. Thomas Bradford actually asked me once if David was intellectually stimulating enough for someone of my caliber. Can you imagine? David had remained there for another 12 minutes, listening to his wife of 8 years describe him like outdated furniture she planned to donate. When she finally ended the call and came inside, he pretended he'd just arrived, kissed her cheek and asked about her day. Just the usual corporate politics, Rachel had said, already checking her phone. You wouldn't get it. That night, David had made 3 decisions. First, he would allow Rachel to proceed with her plan. He wouldn't expose his wealth, wouldn't fight to preserve a marriage she'd already abandoned emotionally. He would give her exactly what she wanted: freedom to leave him for someone from her world. Second, he would ensure the Bradford acquisition of Apex Technologies proceeded smoothly. Rachel wanted those stock options to vest? Perfect. David would personally guarantee the deal's completion. As majority shareholder of Bradford Holdings, he possessed that authority. Thomas never executed major acquisitions without David's approval. Third, he would teach Rachel a lesson about underestimating people, not through confrontation or public shaming, but through the same instrument she'd used to climb her ladder: cold, calculated business strategy. He'd contacted Jennifer Park the following morning. She'd been Stephen Morrison's protege before Stephen died of heart failure in 2020, and she knew everything about David's ownership structure at Bradford Holdings. He'd paid her firm $290,000 over the following 13 months to accomplish 3 objectives: structure the Apex acquisition with specific provisions that would benefit David while appearing standard to Apex's legal team, prepare divorce documents that would reveal David's true net worth at the strategically optimal moment, and create an ironclad postmarital agreement that Rachel would have unknowingly breached through her planned divorce for financial advantage. The Morrison Protocol in subsection 9.7d of the merger agreement was elegant in its simplicity. It stipulated that any Apex executive who initiated divorce proceedings within 18 months of the acquisition closing would forfeit all stock options and bonuses tied to the merger, with those forfeited assets reverting to Bradford Holdings. The clause was camouflaged in dense legal terminology about organizational continuity and executive retention incentives. Apex's attorneys had approved it because similar provisions weren't unusual in major acquisitions. Companies wanted to prevent newly acquired executives from immediately departing. What made it devastating for Rachel specifically was that David had ensured she was designated as a core executive in the merger agreement, meaning the clause applied to her stock options worth $3.1 million, her retention bonus of $1.4 million, and her accelerated vesting schedule for future Bradford equity valued at approximately $5.2 million over 3 years. If Rachel filed for divorce before March 2026, which her own conversation with her attorney indicated she planned to do in 2 weeks, she would forfeit $9.7 million. And because the forfeiture clause was embedded in the merger agreement she'd signed, there was no recourse. It was legally enforceable. But David wasn't finished. He'd also had Jennifer prepare what she termed the revelation package, a comprehensive disclosure of David's actual net worth and ownership stake in Bradford Holdings, timed for revelation during divorce proceedings. Under New York's equitable distribution law, Rachel would be entitled to a fair portion of all assets acquired during the marriage. David's Bradford ownership predated their marriage, but his earnings from that ownership during their 10 years together constituted marital property. Jennifer had calculated that Rachel's equitable share of the marital estate would be approximately $103 million based on the appreciation of David's Bradford stake during their marriage, plus their shared home, vehicles, and other minor assets. But here was the exquisite irony. If Rachel proceeded with her plan to divorce David while positioning herself as the higher-earning spouse, claiming he'd contributed essentially nothing to their financial success, she would have already forfeited her $9.7 million in Apex-related compensation. She'd entered divorce proceedings having just lost nearly $10 million because of her own impatience. And when David revealed his true net worth, she'd realized she could have had $103 million if she'd simply remained married to the man she considered an anchor. The emotional devastation would be exquisite. 3 days after the signing ceremony, David sat in the home office of their Brooklyn brownstone, monitoring through his computer as Rachel prepared for her first official meeting as an executive of Bradford Holdings. She was in their bedroom down the hall, on a video call with her assistant, discussing the agenda for today's integration planning session at Bradford's Hudson Yards headquarters. "Ensure the car service knows to collect me at 9 o'clock sharp," Rachel was saying, applying makeup while balancing her phone on the dresser. "And confirm that Thomas Bradford will be in attendance. I want to establish a strong presence as we transition into the new structure." David smiled slightly. Thomas would indeed be present. So would David, though Rachel didn't know that yet. Today marked the beginning of Phase 3. His phone buzzed. A text from Thomas Bradford. Board meeting confirmed for 3 p.m. All directors present. Are you certain about this? David typed back. Absolutely certain. Time to stop being invisible. For 17 years, David had been content letting Thomas be the face of Bradford Holdings while he operated from the shadows, making the substantive decisions. But Rachel's treatment had awakened something dormant, a desire to be recognized for who he actually was. Not to impress her, not anymore. To make her comprehend the magnitude of her miscalculation. The integration meeting commenced at 11 a.m. David arrived at Bradford's offices at 10:40, using the private executive elevator leading directly to the secure boardroom on the 38th floor. He designed this space himself 4 years ago, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River, a $73,000 custom conference table crafted from reclaimed walnut, original artwork from contemporary artists collectively worth approximately $280,000. Thomas was already there with 7 other Bradford board members. They all knew David, naturally, they'd all signed NDAs regarding his ownership stake. These were individuals who managed endowments worth billions. Sovereign wealth fund directors, former Fortune 100 CEOs. They treated David with the respect his position and intellect commanded. She has no idea? Asked Patricia Liu, former CEO of a $9 billion healthcare company who now sat on 4 corporate boards. Not even a suspicion? None, David confirmed, adjusting his tie. Today he wasn't wearing Macy's clearance items. He wore a bespoke Brioni suit worth $7,200, Berluti shoes worth $2,100, and an Audemars Piguet watch worth $94,000. A gift from Thomas 8 years ago when Bradford Holdings exceeded its first billion in managed assets. This is going to be devastating, said Marcus Webb, Bradford's CFO, who oversaw the firm's $3.8 billion in capital. Are you absolutely certain this is how you want to proceed? David thought about the champagne-stained shirt he'd worn home from the Rosewood 3 days ago. Thought about Rachel's laughter as he'd stood there humiliated. Thought about 16 months of planning, of being called an anchor by the woman who'd promised to love him in prosperity and hardship, for better or worse. I'm certain, he said. The Apex executives began arriving at 10:50 a.m. David watched them on the security monitors. Rachel was among the first, wearing a charcoal Saint Laurent suit worth $8,100, carrying a Celine handbag worth $6,200. She looked confident, formidable, ready to impress her new corporate superiors. She entered the boardroom at precisely 11 a.m., her smile bright and professional, then froze completely when she saw David sitting at the head of the table, flanked by Thomas Bradford and the entire board of directors. Not David, the struggling web developer in discount clothing. David in a $7,200 suit, wearing a watch worth more than her car, sitting in the chairman's position like he owned the place. Because he did. Hello, Rachel, David said calmly, his voice steady. Please have a seat. We have quite a lot to discuss about your future at Bradford Holdings. The color drained from Rachel's face as she finally began to understand. And David's carefully constructed dominoes began to fall. Rachel's fingers trembled slightly as she lowered herself into the high-backed leather chair opposite David. The boardroom felt suddenly claustrophobic, despite the panoramic view of the Hudson. Every expensive detail, the walnut table, the polished marble floors, the steel and glass accents, now seemed to mock her. She could feel the collective gaze of the Bradford board on her, the subtle shifting of feet, the way Patricia Liu's expression barely concealed satisfaction at this unfolding scene. David's calm, unhurried tone carried across the polished table. I understand this transition may feel abrupt, he said, deliberately choosing words that were neutral yet carrying an undercurrent of authority. After all, you've been with Apex Technologies for over a decade and suddenly, everything changes. It's a lot to process. Rachel swallowed. I don't understand. You own Bradford Holdings? You? Her voice caught, her carefully maintained composure cracking. How is this possible? David inclined his head slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. It's not impossible. It's just information that wasn't necessary for you to know. Until now. A murmur rippled through the room. Rachel's eyes darted to Thomas Bradford, hoping for some intervention, some reassurance. But Thomas remained expressionless, his hands folded on the table, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. David continued. I believe in transparency, eventually, and in accountability. Which brings us to today's agenda. Rachel, you've recently signed the Apex acquisition agreement, correct? Yes, she said, voice small. Excellent, David replied. And as you may recall, subsection 9.7d of that agreement has specific stipulations regarding executive actions post-acquisition. His gaze locked onto hers, unblinking. Specifically, any executive who initiates divorce proceedings within 18 months of closing forfeits all merger-related stock options, retention bonuses, and accelerated vesting schedules. Rachel's mind went blank. Her heart pounded as her gaze involuntarily flicked to her tablet, where she had checked her Apex stock portfolio only yesterday. The numbers now felt irrelevant. David leaned forward slightly. In plain terms, Rachel, if you proceed with your planned divorce, all compensation tied to this acquisition, approximately $9.7 million, will revert to Bradford Holdings. Your equity, your retention bonuses, all of it. Legally binding. Executable immediately. Her throat went dry. But, I don't understand. This must be a mistake. My lawyers didn't mention anything like this. David shook his head. Not a mistake. Carefully designed, reviewed, and signed off by Apex's legal team. Your lawyers simply overlooked it. Understandable given the dense legal language. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Rachel's confidence, the armor she had built over years of ruthless corporate ascent, began to crumble. She looked around at the board members. Some tried to suppress smiles, others averted their eyes. She felt exposed, naked, not in body but in reputation and miscalculation. David's voice softened, almost conversational. Rachel, I allowed you the freedom to make your choices. I didn't interfere. I invested in your success, facilitated your rise, even ensured your stock options would vest. You've done remarkably well for yourself, until now. This is simply the consequence of the decisions you've made without fully understanding their ramifications. Rachel's hands shook as she clutched her Celine bag. The blood rushed in her ears. She wanted to speak, to argue, to assert some semblance of control, but no words came. David continued, almost gently. There's more. I believe you should know my net worth, the assets you've underestimated over the years. For the record, my ownership in Bradford Holdings, my personal investments and assets accumulated during our marriage, total roughly $692 million. Your projected share of marital assets, should you proceed as planned, would be approximately $103 million. Her breath hitched. Her mind tried to compute the numbers, the magnitude, the irony. She had planned to extract financial leverage from a man she considered beneath her. Instead, she faced losses she had never imagined and a fortune she might have had simply by not underestimating him. David's eyes softened, but only slightly. I trusted you. I supported you. I didn't interfere because I believed in letting talent rise on its own merit. But underestimating people, underestimating the man standing right next to you, is a costly error. Rachel's voice emerged in a whisper. You played me. David leaned back, expression unreadable. I allowed events to unfold naturally. I gave you freedom. And now you see the consequences. There is no malice here, Rachel. Only business. Only truth. Her knees felt weak. She wanted to sink into the chair, to vanish into the floor beneath the table, but every eye in the room was fixed on her. The irony was crushing. Every whispered critique she had made about David's modesty, his supposed lack of ambition, his irrelevance, now echoed back in a reality she couldn't deny. Thomas Bradford finally spoke, breaking the tension. Rachel, the integration process will proceed smoothly. You will continue as an executive, but your compliance with all terms is essential. Mr. Chin has orchestrated this meticulously. I would advise careful consideration before taking any action that triggers subsection 9.7d. Rachel's mind raced. Every scheme, every plan she had envisioned, the divorce, the financial leverage, her rapid rise, now hung in fragile, ironic suspension. She had believed herself untouchable. She had believed she controlled her narrative. But David had been writing it all along from the shadows. David stood, adjusting his cuffs, an almost imperceptible smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Welcome to Bradford Holdings, Rachel. I hope the view from this perspective is enlightening. She stared at him, mouth dry, body frozen. For the first time in her life she felt small. Not just outmaneuvered in business, but exposed in her own vanity, in her own assumptions, in the very foundation of her pride. David turned and signaled to the assistant at the door. Prepare the revised integration schedule. Rachel, I believe you'll find it comprehensive. As he strode from the boardroom, Thomas Bradford followed. Rachel remained seated, her mind a whirlwind of fear, anger, and awe. For 17 years, David Chin had operated invisibly, silently amassing power and knowledge, guiding empires without fanfare. And now, in a single orchestrated moment, the man she had deemed inconsequential had rewritten the rules entirely. The meeting continued, but Rachel no longer led it. She followed instructions, nodded politely, smiled when necessary. The power dynamics had shifted irreversibly. And when the time came to reconsider her personal plans, the divorce, the ambitions that had driven her for years, she would remember the silent partner who had never truly been silent at all. And somewhere in the distance, David Chin, the man she had once called my anchor, finally allowed himself a small, private smile. The lesson had been delivered, the justice quietly, perfectly exacted. The city stretched beneath him, oblivious as it always had. But in the corridors of power, behind the glass towers and boardroom tables, a new order had been quietly established. One built not on spectacle but on patience, precision, and the subtle, unyielding force of a man underestimated. Rachel would never underestimate him again. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share. Thank you.